Well, first of all, I think the Okinawa issue will be handled one way or another. Now, there are certain ways in which it could come to a crisis. For example, if there's another accident on Okinawa before there's any change in the U.S. posture there. However, I think overall, while it's too bad we waste so much time on new plans and on discussions on this issue, the issue will not prevent the United States and Japan from working closely together. There are just too many other important issues that require their combined attention, and both countries are stronger working with the other one. Neither country gets any benefit out of going it alone. I mean, imagine how Japan could possibly want to challenge or deal with a rising China on its own. That would not be very comfortable, since China's population is almost 10 times as great as Japan's. Whereas the United States and Japan working together represent the core of a group of democracies that may also include Korea, Australia, perhaps others, that can remind China that while we all welcome its emergence on the world stage, we have to see reasonable, compromise kinds of behavior on issues like disputed seabed and sea resources. So that's the kind of an issue where the two countries obviously do better together than alone. And so I would expect that even if the Okinawa issue remains unresolved, and it might, that the alliance will thrive. Well, first of all, let me say a nice word about Richard Holbrooke. I know that he was someone who was known in Japan. Obviously, his government service began in this part of the world, specifically in Vietnam, but he was Assistant Secretary for East Asia, a very, very capable person. Also wound up being Assistant Secretary for Europe, and then, of course, focusing primarily on South Asia the last 2 years. I knew him very well. He was a difficult person in many ways because he was so demanding and he had such a strong sense of his own vision, but it was usually a very wise vision, well-informed, and helpful for the problem that he was trying to tackle. Having said that, I believe the policy towards Afghanistan, while he improved it, did not require his active ongoing presence necessarily. The policy has already evolved through a number of key Americans. In fact, in 2010, we also saw General McChrystal leave his job, and I was an even bigger fan of General McChrystal than I am of Richard Holbrooke. And so, in that regard, we've seen already the ability of the international community to move on. And I think some of what Holbrooke did in Afghanistan will endure. For example, greater focus on civilian and diplomatic efforts and development efforts, more civilian presence in Afghanistan, and a more sensible sort of counter-narcotic strategy that does not focus as much on the eradication of peasant farmer crops. So those things will continue on even without Holbrooke there to maintain stewardship. I think the overall policy is still in trouble. Clearly this war is a very difficult one, and I believe that 2011 will be a year when we have to see if the results really can proceed as we hope, really can improve and justify a continuation of this enormous expense. I realize this is hard and expensive for Japan. It is incredibly hard and expensive for the United States, and also for Britain, and for a couple other countries too. But the United States and Britain are overwhelmingly the countries that are doing the most on this conflict now. And for us, we're spending $100 billion a year, which of course is roughly 10 trillion yen per year, an enormous amount of money. We lost almost 500 Americans in this war in 2010, and it has consumed much of the focus of the top leadership of the United States, including Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton and Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So this is a huge effort for the United States and a large effort for a country like Japan, which has been generous economically. But it's important, certainly if Afghanistan were to fall back into Taliban hands, I think it's almost sure that Al-Qaeda would have a big sanctuary. And also the resistance in Pakistan could establish a sanctuary inside Afghanistan from which to attack targets in Pakistan, perhaps jeopardizing the security of that nuclear-armed country. So I think it's quite important that we try to extract or achieve at least some passable outcome here. But I don't think it's guaranteed. And so one thing I'll be talking about soon is certainly the ongoing effort to develop backup plans, just in case we need those backup plans. There's a lot more to talk about with Afghanistan, but the bottom line is that we have not yet really turned the corner. And 2010 was, on balance, a frustrating year. And I think 2011 is going to have to be a little better year. There is reason to hope that it might be, but we have to watch and see. Well, let me say two things, one of them positive and one of them less positive. First of all, I believe that Japan's financial contributions to this war effort have been extraordinary, and they're very important. We need to be doing a lot of civilian things in Afghanistan. The United States is also spending a great deal of money on that. We're spending $4 billion a year on development in Afghanistan, in addition to the $100 billion we're spending on military operations. And Afghanistan has now become our most expensive foreign aid project, or the foreign aid recipient that gets the most money from us per year. So we do that. We appreciate that Japan is doing that. It's essential if there's going to be hope for this mission. Having said that, I will not pretend or sugarcoat my overall disappointment. I believe Japan and South Korea should both be doing more in this war. And I also believe China should be doing more. I don't see why Northeast Asia should be somehow pretending this is a faraway place when in fact it's much closer to your country than to mine. And I also don't see why the United States should have to carry such a large fraction of the burden when this is an internationally approved, NATO-run operation. This seems consistent with all of Japan's concerns about using its military only in multilateral operations that have a strong humanitarian purpose. Admittedly, this is also a dangerous mission, and that's why Japanese officials and citizens have chosen to stay away from it. But we're living in a dangerous world. I don't think we have the choice or luxury of just deciding that some missions are simply too hard. Frankly, I think that Germany, which has now put 4,000 troops into Afghanistan, has begun to move beyond the historical issues of World War II, and Japan can do the same thing. In fact, because we're speaking about sensitive topics, I will just go ahead and give my additional view that even though World War II was tragic, and even though we all regret what happened then, if Germany can move beyond World War II, so can Japan. Because what Germany did was far worse than what Japan did, even if we still have very serious historical differences between our countries about what happened in that time period. One can understand some of what Japan did. Now, yes, there were very cruel things, yes, there were very bad things, but it was not comparable to the Holocaust or to what Germany did. And yet Germany has found a way, despite its own citizens' nervousness about militarism and the use of military force, Germany's found a way to be involved in the Afghanistan mission on the ground with soldiers, 40 of whom have died in the war. And I don't see any reason why Japan has avoided this. I also see no reason why South Korea cannot put troops on the ground. South Korea has been one of our strongest allies for a long time and has a very good army, deployed forces to Vietnam, which was a far more controversial war, far more violent, and yet this is a conflict that for some reason Northeast Asia has decided collectively to avoid, except through financial and some limited developmental activity. So that's my disappointment, and I really do believe that if Japan and Korea are going to stay in that very top tier of American alliances, that this is the sort of a mission they should be in, on the ground with troops. And I don't think we have to wait 20 or 30 more years for Japan to get further beyond World War II. I think this is the time Japan should be on the ground with its soldiers. I realize there's no chance of that happening, but that's what I think. Well, I'm honored by the opportunity, and I just gave my strong view about what I would wish in a perfect world that Japan would be willing to do in Afghanistan. But I've also said I don't expect that to be a realistic goal. So that's not really what I would expect to focus on today. I think it would be adequate that Japan continue to do at least what it's doing now, diplomatically and economically. Now, I would love to convince Japan to send troops, but I don't think that's very realistic. Well, first, I think there has been important headway with groups like Sasakawa doing such important work. Many Japanese studying in the United States, many Americans studying in Japan. I think the alliance and the partnership more generally is good and very strong. We should continue now to do this in an era without the Cold War to tie us together. Now we really are friends. There are deep bonds between the countries, but we have to find a way to deepen them. And we have our challenges. First of all, we don't have that Cold War to motivate us. Secondly, Japan has had huge economic troubles that have tended to make it feel a little bit more withdrawn from the world in some ways. And third, of course, the demographic trends in Japan are unfavorable, and it's likely to become a little bit of a of a status quo power that has a hard time increasing its capabilities, because even if the economy grows while the population shrinks, on balance, Japan will not gain greater leverage on world affairs in all likelihood. Fourth, the United States is now having economic problems that are very severe and perhaps making Americans a bit more isolationist. And then fifth, when we have crises like Iraq and Afghanistan, the amount of Japanese participation is very limited, which makes one wonder if Mike Mansfield was really correct when he called the USJapan Alliance the most important in the world. I think it is important, but I don't think it can be the most important in the world unless we change towards a more equitable partnership where we actually share the risks as well as the financial costs. So 20 years ago, people used to say that Japan has to move beyond the period of checkbook diplomacy. Unfortunately, 20 years later, Japan has not moved beyond checkbook diplomacy, and in fact, I could say that it did more in the 1990s in places like East Timor than it has done in the last decade. So I think that's going to be a limit on what private foundations and private citizens can do. We're going to need a combination of the private work, the individual work, but also a sense of what this alliance and this partnership are all about. I've been a little bit critical of Japan in Afghanistan. Let me say one very positive thing about Japan where we need to learn in the United States, and that's of course on energy conservation and global warming issues, where Japan's policies are far better than our policies. And we're going to have to work together on that sort of an issue too. So perhaps sustainable development can be one part of our combined purpose. Perhaps peacekeeping operations can be another part. That's going to require Japan to do more than it has in the past. And all of these things can be facilitated by private foundations and private networks. They, however, cannot thrive unless the governments also cooperate. So ultimately, we need to keep our eye on what the governments do. But the private foundations, the universities, the personal exchanges, these make for the possibility of the two countries doing great things together once they have the right political leadership.